Welcome to my GraphQL tutorial. To start, we're going to do yarn add express dash GraphQL, and we're going to copy paste this boilerplate from the express dash GraphQL README. It just defines an Express.js route for our GraphQL server. And since we haven't defined the schema yet, we're going to comment out line 7 here with the schema does not yet exist. And we need to actually go to /GraphQL here. And we get an error that the schema is not created, of course, because we commented it out. So I use this tool, graphql-tools, to create the schema. There's also an official way to do it. It's a little bit more verbose, in my opinion, and I like this tool. So that's graphql-tools, and it gives you this make executable schema. And since we're not using import statements here, we're going to have to switch that to a require. We're going to get an error here about the import statement not being supported. So we'll change that to const and then require. And make executable schema requires type definitions and resolvers. So this is your type definition, just saying like we have a type called author or a type called post. So I'll go ahead and create a schema file, and you could also call that types. And in here, I'm just going to grab one of these types and copy paste that over here. And this should be a relative import here. And we are not using exports, so it's going to be module.exports. And that was called schema here, getting myself confused. Next, let's create the resolvers. So the resolvers are going to tell GraphQL where to get that data when someone requests data of that type. So go ahead and create resolvers.js. Create that now. So you can see it's just a JavaScript object. And at the root, you have a query. That's where you can enter the graph and begin your query. So we're going to have a query field called authors. And I'll just take this comment out of here. It seems to be causing a problem. I'm not going to worry about it right now. And we always need to have a root on our schema or our types called schema, and then you'd have query and mutation. So that's a pattern called command query separation. So something that changes and something that reads data should be separated. So you always have query and mutation, and inside a query we have author. So we're going to create type query now and say on the query field there's going to be a field called authors, and that's going to give you an array of the author type we just created. So everything in here is basically a type. That schema object defines the query and the mutation, and those themselves are actually types. And then your query type defines things you can do, like authors, and that is in turn a type. And so that matches up to this resolver here, authors, and that would return your data. We're doing some kind of database query here in this tutorial. We're just going to hard code it. So we actually don't have author posts. We're just going to have an author object. And we're going to uncomment this now. Switch that back to executable schema that we just created using GraphQL-tools. And now we get what we call graphiQL, or graphical, and that's the graphical query builder. So in here you can hit command space or control space and autocomplete. So we can see we have authors, and on that we can ask for the ID. Here, I'll make that bigger for you. The first name, the last name, and it's got a little built-in documentation, so we can see our query type. On there is authors, gives an array of author that looks like this, and then you can click on the fields to get more information about each field. So it's fully introspectable, meaning when you create your API, it's automatically going to analyze it or introspect it and create this documentation for you and give you these tools like autocomplete, and there's different editor plugins or IDE plugins where you can get that in your editor. I'm not going to cover that here. So let's go ahead and create a resolver. So the authors is going to need to return an array of objects that look like that author type that we just created. So it has an ID, a first name, a last name. So here we're going to turn an array of objects with an ID, first name, and a last name. You don't have to return all the fields. Fields are nullable, so here we could leave off last name, for example. Why isn't this running here? Let's debug this, console.log test. It doesn't even seem to be calling our resolver, it just exits with null. We might have forgot to export something here. So I think that's the problem, module.exports equals resolvers. And there we go, it resolves the data. Right now it just hits our hard-coded array, but that could be a database query. You could do a fetch to a REST API. You could have a GraphQL API that hits another GraphQL API. I probably wouldn't do that. I'd look into stitching. Anyways, let's add another object in here. So this one does have the last name. You can see last name nulled out on one, and if we don't ask for the last name, then we don't get it. We just get what we asked for. And let's go ahead and do a relationship. So author is going to have posts, and that's an array of post objects or post types. So let's create the post type. So we're going to say type post, give it an ID, title, and body. That exclamation mark in the schema just means that field's required, by the way. So if we refresh here, we can see we can go from authors to posts. We can't get posts directly because it's not on the query type. So we have to enter the graph through the authors field, and then we can traverse to the posts field. So let's create a post resolver. So you want to do this outside of the query part of the resolvers because it's, again, not part of the root query. And then we say authors and nest inside there posts. So going from authors to posts, we're going to use this resolver. And this is the GraphQL tools way of defining your resolvers. There's other ways to define resolvers, but I like this. It's mostly standard. So that is case sensitive there. And once we fix that case sensitivity issue, we can see we can grab the posts through each author. And let's say these posts belong to specific authors. You don't want every post for every author. Your resolver actually passes in some arguments or takes in some arguments. So in the GraphQL tools documentation, if we go to resolvers, it's right here. And we want resolver function signature. There we go. So it takes in an object, which is the parent object. So for the post, that's the author. It's where we came from in the query. As we're traversing the graph, we went through the author, and then from the author to the post. And then the second argument is args. That's like if we're asking for a specific post ID, it'll be in the args. And I just pass an underscore on the root authors because it has no parent object. It would be null. And down here, I'll say if author ID is 1, then return this array of posts. So now author 2 no longer has any posts. It's just null because the resolver didn't return anything. And we could give that author some posts. And check out my GraphQL demo repository here, where I hit this guy's blog, I list posts, and then go fetch each post, and then coalesce that all into one query and response. If you're doing that from like a mobile app, you'd have to hit the list route, look at the response, and hit the other routes. And GraphQL is just a nice pattern for speeding up your app and getting exactly what you need. I go through some use cases here, and I have some visual diagrams to help you wrap your head around this, and a link to another YouTube video that I found helpful. So link to this in the description.